Pakistan at COP27. Introduction. The United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP27, opened on November 6 in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt, with the main theme of loss and damage funding. At COP27, negotiators, led by Pakistan as chair of G77, produced an accord to set up a fund for loss and damage remarkable given how controversial the issue is, and it had never been on a formal agenda at a COP summit until this year. Vulnerable nations most affected by climate change have been pushing for discussions around climate compensation for years. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres praised the setup of a fund for climate damage but also voiced his discontent with the failure of global warming targets. Our planet is still in the emergency room. We need to drastically reduce emissions now, and this is an issue this COP did not address. John Kerry, U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, agreed to discuss the idea of financing for loss and damage, a move that helped avoid a bitter fight over the summit's agenda. German Federal Development Minister Svenja Schulze said Germany stood by its responsibility to support vulnerable people and states in dealing with loss and damage. The EU threatened to walk out of the talks if the global agreement was not enough to keep 1.5 alive, a phrase that became the mantra of last year's COP26 talks. It refers to the 2015 Paris Agreement to keep global warming well below 2°C, and ideally 1.5°C, from pre-industrial times. Pakistan's take. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif called the recent floods that ravaged Pakistan a man-made disaster and observed that loss and damage needed to be part of the core agenda of the COP27 conference to meet the pressing humanitarian needs of those trapped in a crisis of public financing fueled by debt, and yet to fund climate disasters on their own. Delivering the national statement at the World Leaders Summit of the conference in Sharm el Sheikh, the Prime Minister suggested the global goal for adaptation needed to be prioritized, both in terms of financing and timelines. We're yet to see half-and-half balance in adaptation and mitigation finance. The current financing gap is too high to sustain any real recovery needs of those on the front lines of climate catastrophe. He further called for clearly defining climate finance as new additional and sustained resources with a transparent mechanism that met the needs of developing and vulnerable countries with the speed and scale required. The PM added that there should be total clarity on what counts as climate transfer and development finance. A global climate risk index of all parties of the UNFCCC needs to be developed under the auspices of the UN system. Mitigation ambition needs to be revived and a clear burden share formula. Unless there was a transformational shift in the flow of capacities, finance, and technology that reversed the pyramid of climate capital, the bargain between North and South would not work. Explaining the extent of damage the floods caused to Pakistan. If we have to fight and rebuild and repair our infrastructure, which has to be resilient and adaptive, we can only do so through additional funding, not additional loans and debts, as this would be a financial debt trap, concluding that it was now or never. For us, there is indeed no planet B. According to Dr. Adil Najam, we have already seen this in the emergence of climate justice and loss and damage as major issues on the COP27 docket. This is significant because major industrialized high-emission countries that had been able to block these issues from COP negotiations in the past have not been able to do so this time. It's unlikely that any real headway on either of these issues will be made in Egypt, but they can no longer be avoided. The more volatile the climate impacts become, the more contentious climate politics will be. As Pakistan has been leading the call for developed nations to compensate their developing counterparts for a crisis they did not cause, the experts believe the mere inclusion of loss and damage onto the agenda at the COP27 climate conference in Egypt was a diplomatic achievement for Islamabad. Conclusion. Pakistan welcomed the announcement that countries adopted a hard-fought final agreement at the COP27 climate summit that sets up a fund to help poor countries being battered by climate disasters. Poor countries suffering from the effects of climate change will get financial help from richer nations under a historic agreement by the UN. But the talks ended in discord after negotiators failed to reach a deal on greater cuts to greenhouse gas emissions and an end to fossil fuel use. For any national climate strategy to be successful, the promotion of climate awareness and education must become the overarching national priority. The only route to global and national survival is through a global and Pakistan Green New Deal, including a financing plan for it, to generate the momentum to become independent of the financial bromides on offer and to begin to put in place a progressively unfolding strategy for radical political, social, and economic change. For any national climate strategy to be successful, the promotion of climate awareness and education must become the overarching national priority. The only route to global and national survival is through a global and Pakistan Green New Deal, including a financing plan for it, to generate the momentum to become independent of the financial bromides on offer and to begin to put in place a progressively unfolding strategy for radical political, social, and economic change.